Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. Tonight is May 30th, 2016, and we're going to talk about mainly the Syrian crisis. We're going to talk about other things if we get the opportunity. Tonight we are on the road still. We were last week as well, so I apologize for any background noise that you might hear. I think last week there was some traffic that could be overheard, so we apologize if that's distracting, but that's what we're working with here on the road. Now, I want to remind you that if you're just joining us here tonight for the first time, you can catch Truth on the Tracks every Monday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here at ucy.tv, and you can access the show's personal webpage at ucy.tv/TT for Truth on the Tracks. And on that page, you'll find the archives of the show. You'll find the YouTube videos and links to my articles as they come up on BrandonTurbeville.com. Now, if you're interested in my work, I'd remind you that you can check out activistpost.com, naturalblaze.com, eraofwisdom.org. But you can also go to BrandonTurbeville.com, and that's where I recommend that you go in any event to keep up with my work specifically. That's the website where I repost all of my articles, all of the YouTube videos, all of the relevant information there on that site. So please go check that on a regular basis. And we're going to add some things. Most of the books now are available on Amazon.com in one format or the other, generally both. And on BrandonTurbeville.com, you'll find the Store tab. That's something that's been there for years, and it's not been utilized, but we are going to get it utilized fairly soon. So the site continues to be updated and improved, so I encourage you to go there, make that your hub for news and activism. We're going to be publishing a list of demands as well, sort of the New Deal for the United States, and we're going to be going through that probably next week. Once we get it published and let it circulate, we can discuss it on one of the next broadcasts. Now, tonight we want to look at the Syrian crisis. Before we do, I want to make a comment or two about Saudi Arabia. We've got the degenerate, hedonistic ruling class of genetic royalty in Saudi Arabia, right? These Saudi Arabian princes simply roll around in money and women and unspeakable, depraved forms of entertainment and oversee a nation of slaves and prisoners, right? Despite all of that, the bank accounts of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia are now somewhat at a low point. After years of decadence and willingness to just lavishly fund terror and propaganda all across the world, and after agreeing to work with the United States in what is really a suicidal attempt to hurt Russia, the oil export pump, Saudi Arabia is finally starting to realize that there might actually be a bottom to their own bank accounts. So even as Saudi corporations begin to go belly up, remember the bin Laden group is essentially bankrupt. That company is going out in terms of being officially known as the bin Laden Group, right? It's bankrupt. The Saudi government is now openly considering massive cuts. Its massive contracting population. It's now considering paying them in IOUs and tradable bonds, right? We have reports coming from places like Bloomberg that say that Saudi Arabia has told banks in the country that it's considering giving contractors IOUs to settle some of the outstanding bills, and that's according to people with knowledge of those discussions. As payment from the state, contractors would receive these bond-like instruments which they could hold on to until maturity or even sell on to banks. The companies have already received some payments in cash, but the rest could be in the form of the IOU notes. And it's also pointed out that they haven't made an official decision on the measures, but this is something that's being discussed, right? They've already slowed payments to contractors and suppliers. They've already tapped their foreign reserves and borrowed from both local and international banks in response to the decline in crude oil. So we're seeing those signs add up in that direction. Even Moody's, remember the notorious lying ratings agency that gave derivatives in the United States the go-ahead and gave them good credit ratings before the collapse up until the last minute. Even Moody's downgraded the Saudi long-term issuing rate from A1 to AA3. We have reports coming out of Bloomberg in regards to that as well. We won't go over that. That's too many specifics for the time we have. But all this comes as Saudi Arabia is threatening to sell off hundreds of billions of dollars of U.S. assets if Congress passes a bill that would allow the families of the victims of 9/11 to sue Saudi Arabia. Now, Obama, predictably, has already threatened to veto the bill, but the threats of Saudi Arabia to sell those assets off were already murky to begin with. They're already questionable. But after the news of the Saudi financial crisis, it's less likely that the Saudis would actually go through with the threat. Either way, we expect Obama to veto the bill. They don't want any more information coming out about 9/11, and that's fairly obvious. Now, I also have a number of articles that I want to draw your attention to. We have one article on BrandonTurbeville.com, Syrian analyst Afrad Dogger to U.S. Is it normal to kill kids? Women, is it normal for you? I encourage you to check out that article on my website so you can watch the video that's posted there. So we have this series of coordinated suicide bombs, right? Perhaps we should discuss that before we discuss the video. We need to discuss this issue because it's been in the news, well, in the alternative media. I don't know how much it's been in the news in the mainstream. But so regardless, we have a series of coordinated and organized suicide bombings across the Syrian coast on Monday that's left around 120 people dead. And despite the worldwide expression of solidarity that occurred when we had the Paris attacks and the Belgian attacks, there's been no mention of the Syrian attacks, nor has there been any mass expression of solidarity or condolences with Syria. Now, these attacks took place in Tartus and Jobla. These are two cities that are both fiercely loyal to the Syrian government, where two Russian bases are located. We've got Syrian state media reporting a bit of a lower death toll than the Western media and the terror-supporting activists, or activist known as the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. But regardless, somewhere in between this perhaps lies the truth. We have 2 or 3 blasts taking place in Tartus, while 4 explosions took place in Jobla. One bomber was actually captured after his bomb failed to kill him along with the victims. It's quite amazing that he survived, but apparently he did. The blasts were clearly coordinated to take place at a time when the target areas were expected to be crowded with civilians. In Jobla, the bombings hit a busy bus station, a government electricity office, an emergency room, hospital entrance. Tartus, the bombs hit a residential neighborhood and another bus station. So all this happened basically within the scale time span of about 25 minutes. And residents are still fearing the possibility of more attacks in the region over the coming weeks. They feel that this quite isn't the end of it. Now, ISIS is being reported as being responsible for the attack in Western media. That's what Western media is saying, that ISIS is responsible. They're citing a report from Amaq. That's a news agency associated with ISIS, and curiously allowed to operate despite the West maintaining the most sophisticated surveillance and electronic warfare state on the planet. These guys are able to maintain a news agency online, and this is where they allegedly took credit for the bombings. Now, the attacks also come after an alleged ISIS spokesman, Abu Muhammad al-Adnai, who allegedly urged ISIS fighters to increase the frequency of suicide attacks since the group has been suffering a number of defeats in head-on battle situations in Syria. Adnai's call was allegedly issued before the weekend. Now, on the other hand, we have Syrian media, which is reporting that Ahrar al-Sham is the responsible party for the bombing. Now, the question of which terrorist organization is responsible for the bombing is actually incredibly important in terms of international politics, and it could have far-reaching effects on the geopolitical scene. Now, ever since the ceasefire agreement that excludes ISIS and Nusra, Syria and Russia have argued that Ahrar al-Sham is also a terrorist organization and should be excluded from the ceasefire agreement. And they're exactly right. Ahrar al-Sham is indeed a terrorist organization. The United States, however, is refusing to label Ahrar al-Sham as one of the organizations that make up, the terrorist groups there in Syria. It makes up the bulk of the so-called Syrian opposition, right? They're refusing to label Ahrar al-Sham as a terrorist group, and it's conveniently an organization that makes up the bulk of the so-called Syrian opposition. Now, if the responsible party was indeed Ahrar al-Sham, then the United States can just chalk up one more horrific atrocity to their publicly supported pets, and they could be facing a difficult row to hoe in front of the rest of the world as the bankrupt U.S. administration inevitably tries to obfuscate and defend the terrorist group in front of the rest of the world. But Syria and Russia don't necessarily need to point to the bombings in Tartus and Jobla as an example of why Ahrar al-Sham is a terrorist organization. They don't need to prove that Ahrar al-Sham was the guilty party. The group has already committed untold numbers of atrocities in Syria against soldiers and civilians, and in my article I provide quite a bit of citations for this. Right, there's several citations for the atrocities committed by Ahrar al-Sham. There's absolutely no difference between that group and ISIS besides a name change. That's it. They both have the same goal of Sharia. They both hate minorities, Christians, Alawites, Shiites. They both torture. They both rape. And we can go on and on. We should also mention that the U.S. and NATO support both organizations, right? For public relations needs, we have the U.S. being able to claim that Ahrar al-Sham is the good, moderate terrorist organization that's somehow fighting for democratic jihad or democratic jihadism. But when an atrocity is committed that gains the attention in the media, then we have ISIS, the bad extremist terrorist organization that's fighting for extreme jihadism. They can immediately take the credit and the blame. So the United States has the good guy or semi-good guy and the bad guy in the playbook. So it's much like a movie script here, but the script is more of something that resembles a sequel that's gone through so many presentations that not only are the scenes predictable, but the actors are just wholly unconvincing and the plot entirely unbelievable. So unfortunately, this crisis bears another uncanny resemblance to a bad movie script, and that is the fact that the American people simply eat it up without any question. So go read my article if you want to see those citations of the Ahrar al-Sham atrocities. And the article is Which Terrorist Bombed Jobla Tartus, ISIS or Moderate Terrorists? And that's up at activistpost.com and BrandonTurbeville.com. Now we also need to look at the differences that are being told to the American people about the moderate terrorists and the extremists. So what's the big difference between the moderate terrorists and the extremist terrorists who are running rampant in Syria today? Now, at one time we were told there were no terrorists at all. We went through that together here on this show, if you remember. Then we were told terrorists were present, but that they were also moderate, secular, and democracy-loving freedom fighters in the country. Now, after the nature of the so-called rebels has been revealed ad infinitum by the alternative and independent press, it's being admitted that the fighters in Syria are terrorists, but apparently some moderate terrorists and some are extreme terrorists. So They all have the same goal as Sharia, as I mentioned. They all hate minorities. They all hate Christians. They all hate Alawites and Shiites. They all torture and rape, all of that stuff. It's all the same. But in the world of the West's rebels, there's not one shred of evidence between any of the armed groups fighting against the secular Syrian government besides the names that they call themselves. Or not one shred of difference, I should say. Not one bit of difference between the groups. But we're being told that there are clear differences and that the U.S. State Department knows what those differences are. But they aren't telling the American people. They're not telling the Russians or the Syrians or anybody. The moderate terrorists are really, this is a very mysterious force, I guess. A group, we speak of these people, but they never show themselves. Now, there are groups that the United States admits are brutal killers, but somehow rationalizes to the public that they're our brutal killers. In other words, the U.S. can, at times, be forced to admit that the groups it supports as freedom fighters have committed atrocities, rapes, murder, torture, establishment of Islamic theocracy on unwilling inhabitants, that sort of thing. But the U.S. Can admit, when it's pressured hard enough to do so, that these groups have the same ideology as ISIS, but they won't ever admit that in those exact words. They'll never actually say that these groups have the same ideology as ISIS, but they will admit that they have committed atrocities and that they want to impose Sharia, for instance. So it's clear that any designation of terrorist groups as extremist or moderate is just, it's obviously based on political motivation and geopolitical designs, not the nature or action of the terrorist group in question. If that were the case, then Ahrar al-Sham or Jaish al-Islam and other groups would be listed as terrorist organizations and then not covered under the ceasefire agreement. So there's no distinguishing characteristic that sets these groups apart from ISIS or Nusra other than a name. Right? So when the Russians attempted to remove these groups from the list of non-protected terrorists in Syria, the protected terrorists at the insistence of the West, I should point out, the United States, Britain, France, Ukraine, these countries rushed to their rescue and blocked the Russian proposal. So despite the fact that both of these groups, which make up around half of the Syrian opposition forces, thanks to Western name changes, have repeatedly worked together with Nusra and ISIS forces. Jaish al-Islam and Ahrar al-Sham have both worked so closely with ISIS and Nusra that the groups are virtually interchangeable. But still, the U.S. is just continuing to dig its own international public relations grave with the refusal to designate known and obvious terrorists as precisely that, particularly when it was launched campaigns of destruction and death across the world on the basis of allegedly fighting terror. Now, the Russians are now forcing the Western nations to admit that despite their rhetoric, terrorist organizations are doing their bidding and have never truly been the target of NATO forces. While the Western public remains entirely befuddled as to the nature of the crisis in Syria. In fact, many of them don't even know there's a crisis in Syria. Western propaganda has created such a complex and distorted view of the situation that any newcomer or casual observer would find it incredibly difficult to navigate through the lies and deceit of the media. But for the rest of the world, much of that propaganda is entirely ridiculous and transparent, and for that reason, as well as many other reasons, the United States and NATO are losing more and more credibility by the day. Just take a look at the videos of Mark Toner, the spokesman for the State Department, who is unable to explain the U.S. position on Ahrar al-Sham. Go look at my article, What's the Big Difference Between NATO's Moderates and Extremists in Syria? And there's two videos at the bottom. It's Mark Toner trying to explain what's happening in Syria and what the U.S. position is, and watch how it's virtually impossible for this guy to do so in a logical manner. It's quite embarrassing in terms of public relations. Now, what I mentioned earlier was the article, Syrian Analyst Afra Dagher to U.S., Is it normal to kill kids, women? Is this normal for you? This is up on BrandonTurbeville.com and ActivistPost.com. And it is essentially a write-up of the interview that Afra did with EDTV, and Amy Anderson conducted the interview where they talked about the bombings in Tartus and Jobla. It's really interesting. I mean, it's something that people need here in the U.S. particularly need to understand, that nowhere outside of American borders does anybody truly believe that the United States represents freedom and democracy. All right, that is a lie that is reserved for hundreds of millions of people residing in the U.S. Who are constantly plugged into American media and the barrage of pro-war propaganda. But it's highly ironic because it's the American people who are actually the key to stopping the American war machine from continuing to march across the rest of the world and then eventually coming back here and settling down at home to march upon its own population. So it's up to the American people to stop that war machine before it continues, and to stop it before it gets to a point of no return. But in Syria, which is about 6,000 miles away from the United States, and it's been besieged by war for 5 years, intense warfare, the people there are fully aware of who brought this to their doorsteps. Even if Americans are unaware that the destruction is even taking place, Syrians are aware of who's doing it. And in this, I'll just read part of Afra's statement here. She says, "There's a mastermind behind this. Such an attack is well organized and it's planned. It's an organized plan to destroy our infrastructure, battle stations, hospitals, electricity directorate, many of our important and sensitive sites, killing our people. So-called Ahrar al-Sham announced their responsibility, but the U.S. refuses to designate it or to classify it as a terrorist group at the UN. Later, the so-called ISIS declared its responsibility. As I said, there's no presence of ISIS in our cities in the coastal area. They are just a cover. At the time, Israeli media was so happy to announce that this is a great attempt to kill those who support Assad and who support their government. Al Jazeera also reported it as ISIS. It's not ISIS, it's the moderate rebels of the West bombing Assad's strongholds." Okay, that's her quote. Now, she also, at another point in the interview, she addresses the perpetrators of the attacks, the root of the problem, the United States and NATO and the GCC and Israel. And she most notably addresses the West, because the West is always harping on about the need for democracy in countries other than their own. This is what she said. "Is this your democracy, to kill who is against you and your views and who is believing what I believe in my government? So you must kill me. Is this your democracy? I think you are slaughtering every Syrian, every day. Aleppo, Deir el-Zor, Raqqa, Latakia, Jobla, Tartus. And I see it as also a message to Russia, because Russia has its air base in Tartus. They say, we are here, we can hit any point we want." Please watch the video about this. Is it a crime, a war crime, or is it normal to kill kids, women, innocent people? Is this normal for you? Well, end quote. Unfortunately, the answer to that question is yes, it is normal for the United States to kill women and kids and innocent people. It's something that the United States has been doing nonstop for decades. But please watch the video. It's as I said, it's an interview with Amy Anderson of EdTV with Afra Dagher, and it's located in that article. Syrian analyst Afra Dagher to U.S. Is it normal to kill kids, women? Is this normal for you? Up at BrandonTurbeville.com and ActivistPost.com. Now, since we have discussed a number of the recent incidents in Syria, I think I'd like to go back briefly and discuss this issue of the Assad must go policy. This is something we keep hearing from horse-faced John Kerry and from Obama, that Assad must go. There can't be a legitimate political transition that, of course, the United States is determining must take place in another country 6,000 miles away, but there can't be a political transition without Assad stepping down, and that he's not legitimate, etc., etc. Assad has been presented as a brutal dictator for the entirety of this crisis, right, with the Western media and the State Department. If you believe the Western media reports, you'd end up thinking that Assad had launched indiscriminate attacks on civilians, the gas children. You'd think that he, has probably beheaded innocent people, or he's some type of head of an Alawite regime where there's some type of religious fundamentalism going on. All of this, of course, is untrue, right? This is a key problem with that story, is that Assad is extremely popular in Syria. The fact that there's been popular dissatisfaction with corruption and cronyism and police brutality and somewhat of an authoritarian state, that's not to negate the fact that Assad is extremely popular, right? How many of those issues that I just listed are not issues here in the United States? Police brutality, corruption, cronyism, my God, authoritarianism, all of that applies just as well to the United States as it does anywhere else. Just a bit about Assad. This is a guy who did not even want to be president of Syria, right? He's an eye doctor. He's a very mild-mannered eye doctor who received much of his training in Britain. He was essentially conscripted to the presidency by the Ba'ath Party after the death of his father and then the death of his brother, sort of an unexpected death of his brother. Hafez, the father, died in 2000, and his brother died shortly after that. Now, Bashar was expected, on one hand, to maintain the pluralist and nationalist legacy of his father, and on the other hand, was expected to develop more important elements of political and economic reform. Hafez al-Assad had brought around 3 decades of internal stability to Syria. There was a lot of turmoil in the 1960s, but after Hafez assumed power through a number of means, and there were authoritarian means, there was stability that was brought to the country. And despite the authoritarianism, that did allow for some social advances. And social divisions in terms of religion and ethnicity and stuff were somewhat smoothed because of the strong pressure to identify as Syrian, not as a Muslim or Kurd, etc. There was the idea that you would identify as Syrian as a nationality. There was also substantial improvements in education and health and literacy for women. I think between 1970 and 2010, if you want some statistics, infant mortality fell from 132 to 14 per 1,000, right? So 132 per 1,000 in 1970. In 2010, it was 14 per 1,000. Maternal mortality, it was 482 per 100,000 in 1970, and in 2010 it was 45 per 100,000. These are pretty good outcomes and improvements for a country that had such a small level of GDP per capita, right? The electricity supply to rural areas went from 2%, only 2% in 1963, to 95% in 1992. These were the Assads. So they combined this social pluralism with advances in education, which drove human development of the country well ahead of the other wealthier states in the region, and there were many wealthier states in the region. So that system built by Hafez al-Assad was socially inclusive, but it was still admittedly an authoritarian state. It was definitely a one-party state. This was not a democracy. Part of that was influenced by the war with Israel and the violent insurrections by the Muslim Brotherhood, the Western-backed Muslim Brotherhood. So you can kind of see, I'm not justifying this here to be clear, but you can kind of see where the tendency for heavy-handedness comes in some of these states. We had the U.S. intelligence agencies actually observed that crushing the Muslim Brotherhood's insurrection in the 1980s, again, these insurrections were somewhat funded by the West, but the crushing those insurrections were welcomed by the overwhelming majority of Syrians. They might not have been fans of the authoritarianism of Hafez al-Assad, but they were most certainly not fans of the Muslim Brotherhood, and that they supported the government action after that, right? But unfortunately, after the Muslim Brotherhood insurrection, and after that was crushed, criticism of the government was viewed with great suspicion. So you'd have sectarian groups being banned. We saw the banning of the acceptance of foreign funds for political purposes. Now that does not necessarily indicate authoritarianism. This is something, especially when you are facing a Western color revolution apparatus and a Western state sponsorship of terrorism, where foreign money for political purposes should largely be banned. This is something that the United States has fallen backwards on with Citizens United and that sort of thing, where foreign money can indeed be used to influence political developments inside of countries. This is not authoritarianism to ban that in any way, but the suspicion of which people were viewed who had questioned the government or who had expressed dissent was, somewhat causing a climate where legitimate dissent was more quelled than it should have been. They didn't know how to take the dissenters did not necessarily know how to take initiative and develop ideas in a way that would bring about change, but also not send them into a jail cell. They had the Syrian secret police that were indeed feared, and a lot of this again was driven by the fear of the government, of Zionist spies, of Muslim Brotherhood insurrections, and all of that kind of stuff. So there was this wide network of people, this dragnet that was not just catching Israeli spies or Muslim Brotherhood terrorists. It was drawing in a wider range of government critics, right? So some of them even from the secular opposition side, and so forth. Now, we also have other questions. The secular opposition, for instance, like the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, were unhappy with a compromise that was made by Hafez al-Assad, which was part of the constitution requiring that the president be a Muslim. There was resentment at the corruption that was sort of built on cronyism through the Ba'ath Party networks, and all of that was the culture into which Bashar came into power. This was a system that was teetering on the edge and trying to protect against overthrow coming from the West, coming from the Muslim Brotherhood, coming from the Zionist networks. At the same time, it was a government that which was guilty of overreach in terms of violation of civil liberties and so forth. Now again, I point out that Assad was in England. He was an eye doctor. This was a guy who did not want to become president. Only because of an unexpected death of his brother was he brought in. And many people have suspected, and it's possible, very possible, that Bashar's brother was actually killed by Western intelligence agencies to put Bashar al-Assad in power. And the reason why they would do that is because of Bashar's personality traits, right? He's mild-mannered. He doesn't want to be president. The other guy does. So you want the other guy out of the office and put a guy who's resentful. He doesn't want to be there to begin with. He doesn't have the personality of what one would consider a world leader. Therefore, he's going to be weak. He's not going to be able to resist Western dictates. He's not going to really put up much of a fight. And if there is a fight, he will capitulate rather quickly to get back to his life in Europe. What a mistake that was, if they indeed made that mistake, because that has proven the opposite of how Assad has reacted. So a man who did not want to become president of Syria to begin with has now become one of the most courageous world leaders of the 21st century. So if that was what happened in terms of how he was placed into power. Now, to be clear, I am not suggesting that Bashar was in any way involved in this. That's the point, is that the Western intelligence agencies may have put him in power simply because he did not want to be in power. But if that's the case, then they made a dreadful mistake on their part, because he has proven to be one of the most stealthy and stalwart resistance fighters in the world. Now, just to look at the reform movement itself, at the beginning of the 2000s, right, the beginning of the 21st century, we have Bashar al-Assad was considered the official candidate for reform, but there was also a large but fragmented anti-Ba'ath Party political opposition, and a lot of people saw the chance of reform through Bashar, but other ones again saw an opportunity to take part on this, and these people would be the remnants of the Muslim Brotherhood who had been banned. They wanted to dismantle the secular state, establish some sort of theocracy. And this element was fairly small and fairly funded from the West, right? This was many of them may have indeed been Syrian, but at this point, and we're talking in terms of political change and political color revolution types, they may have been indigenous, but the money was most certainly not indigenous. These groups were being supported by the West. And in terms of the opposition in Syria, if you wanted to see the opposition, you could look right down the road in Damascus to the parliament. This is where the legitimate opposition was. After Assad took power, Bashar al-Assad took power, we could see that the opposition, that there was reforms taking place. There was an opening and a welcoming of different viewpoints and political parties and so forth in Syria. But the element that wanted to establish the theocracy, these were the guys, some of them, of course, found themselves in various positions in government, not appointed, but perhaps stealthily managing to get themselves into government positions. The majority of them were agitators, though. The majority of these guys were agitators who were funded outside of the country. And then we have the idea of the Damascus Spring in 2000. But now Bashar, again, as I said, was seen as an agent of reform in Syria. But his rise to power, of course, was dependent on different networks of the Ba'ath Party, right? The Ba'ath Party really was and it still is to a large degree, the center focus of political movement in Syria. When he took power, there were no dramatic political reforms, despite all the widespread complaints of corruption. So he did have some fairly wide-ranging socioeconomic reforms, like the mass education and citizenship reforms. Had a controlled economic liberalization. Now, part of this was not something to be lauded, right? There was an element of privatization that is positive when you're coming from a country that is socialist or Marxist in a way. But there's also an element of privatization that's negative, and that is the privatization of public services, the privatization of virtually everything. There's an element for government services there. And in Syria, this was largely based on some socialist ideology, sort of Arab socialism. So there was economic liberalization which was taking place and opening up to new markets. Not necessarily a bad thing all of the time, but not necessarily a good thing either. It depends on what's being privatized and what's not being privatized. Assad released several thousand political prisoners. Many of them were Islamists and Islamist sympathizers, and this would prove to be a major mistake on his part. Now, Unfortunately for Assad, in the early years, he didn't have an organized constituency outside of the Ba'ath Party. And this is, in part, to compensate for this, he had to build links with businessmen and several government-sponsored NGOs with youth and students and civil society sectors and rural workers and that sort of things. Some groups like that were the Syrian Trust for Development, the Fund for Integrated Rural Development of Syria. We see Asma al-Assad. This is the First Lady of Syria. She had a prominent role in some of these groups, particularly the ones that had to do with the young people and children. They also got some international partners involved, the UNDP and UNICEF, etc. This was what was being called the Damascus Spring, right, in 2000. It was the quote is that it was a flowering of expression, assembly, and political action unknown since the 1950s. Right, so this is not the Arab Spring. Don't confuse it with the Arab Spring color revolution. It was called the Damascus Spring, and that description comes from Seth Wekus in his article "Battling the Line of Damascus," who he wrote for the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, neocon organization. But we have a number of critical political discussion groups being established during that time. There was the Kawakibi Forum, the Atasi Forum, the National Dialogue Forum. They began to issue statements of demands against the government, and they got about 1,000 prominent signatures on those petitions. But the state of emergency laws still existed, right? They still existed in Syria because of the emergency coming from the Muslim Brotherhood and the Israelis. And in a number of these groups, the groups that I just mentioned, there were conspirators, right? There were spies involved in these groups. A lot of them were arrested. Now, this became termed the Damascus Winter, right? So it was seen as a positive change with Assad's reforms that were becoming more likened to the West in terms of the privatization. Again, that's not a good thing necessarily, but it depends on how much socialism you're actually coming from, when it could be a good thing in specific instances. So we won't get into the details of that. Maybe we'll do that some other point in the future on this show. But needless to say, once these groups and these forums were established, again, the Kawakibi, the Atasi, the National Dialogue Forum, all these things were established, and these are just three, but there were many more. It was identified that agents of other powers were involved in these forums. In other words, Western involvement, Israeli involvement, GCC involvement, etc., were found in these forums to be acting as provocateurs and agitators to level demands toward the Syrian government in order to destabilize it, in order to create some type of opposition. And as a result of that, a lot of these guys were arrested, and that's what the Western press started calling the Damascus Winter. Still, there was never any unified anti-Assad, anti-Syrian government coalition. This is not some popular movement, right? This was essentially Western-backed attempts to foster some type of revolution in the country. And this was not, the demands that they were making were not necessarily the demands that were of the interests of the Syrian people. Now, a couple of those groups, the Atasi Forum for Democratic Dialogue, did continue to meet and take place. They also had the Committee for the Revival of Civil Society that was involved as well. And then about 3 years later, we have the invasion of Iraq, the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And Syria, at that point, was caught between two powerful occupying armies. On the eastern side, you have the United States. On the southwestern side, you have Israel. And both being hostile to Syria. We had more than 1 million Iraqi refugees passing into Syria to escape the United States democracy and freedom. And Syria was quite generous with Iraqi refugees. They provided a lot of care and housing and support for the Iraqi refugees, but the United States started responding that Syria was actually backing the Iraqi resistance, and as a result, sanctions were imposed on Syria. Now, in 2005, there was another interesting development. Syria abruptly withdrew from Lebanon. They had occupied part of Lebanon after 30 years of occupation. They abruptly withdrew, and then we saw Lebanon's subsequent Cedar Revolution. They helped spark another period of this, I don't know what you would call it, opposition activity. So this Cedar Revolution, of course, was a color revolution. And this is where we started to see where opposition groups, and I use that, color revolution-based opposition groups, started to show some kind of unity with each other in the Syrian sphere. Let's move on here. The October 2005, there was the creation of the Damascus Declaration, which was something that was created by a weird group of people, right? We have Islamists, liberals, Marxists, Arabs, Kurds, all that kind of stuff, right? They claim that this is the largest opposition gathering in the history of Ba'ath Party rule since 1963, and that it was demanding pluralism, nonviolence, opposition unity, and democratic change. That's what people were being told. The statement of that group began with the assertion that Ba'athist rule had disempowered the Syrian people and claimed that the authorities' monopoly of everything over 30 years had established an authoritarian and totalitarian cliquish regime that had led to a lack of interest in politics and society from the Syrian people, and that people were losing interest in public affairs. They called for the establishment of a democratic national regime, peaceful, gradual, founded on accord, and based on dialogue and recognition of the other. What does all that mean? It also publicly shunned violence and exclusion, and argued for that. But again, what does all this mean? Are we really to believe that a group that includes Islamists and Marxists, for one thing, and the Kurds can go into the Marxist groups, that they really push for pluralism and tolerance? These are two groups, Marxists and Islamists, that do not respect tolerance. They are the most intolerant groups of political ideologies. So look at this this call, right? It says it doesn't want violence, it doesn't want exclusion, but it says that Islam should be recognized as the most prominent cultural component in the life of the nation, and it rejected the idea of a one-party state. Well, that's fine, but the idea here is that they were calling Islam to be the center of the country. The problem is Syria is not just Islam, right? No country is just Islam or just Christianity or just Judaism. This is a call for an element of theocracy. They did oppose emergency law and martial law and special courts. All of that is fine. But the idea here was that many of these guys were calling for the weakening of the defense mechanisms of the Syrian state. Can't criticize them for calling for the end of martial law, etc. But this is, you can see the way the plan was working out. They had popular organizations like trade unions and other bodies. They had to be liberated from the custodianship of the state and from Ba'athist party and security hegemony. Some of these demands are not so bad, right? The system should emphasize Syria's affiliation to the Arab order with a view to Arab unity, and that sort of thing. So they wanted a just democratic solution for the Kurdish issue in Syria. They ended calling for a national conference which would lead to the election of a constituent assembly and a new constitution on the basis of a political majority. Now, that level of opposition broke down fairly quickly on predictable lines. The leaders of the Marxist left and the Islamic right couldn't find common ground. These guys are not so tolerant. We had liberals and exiles, Kurds, Assyrians participating, etc. We had the Muslim Brotherhood then going on to create the Salvation Front in 2006, and that was the Muslim Brotherhood's attempt to foster a resurgence. In 2007, there was Damascus Declaration's National Council meeting where the Socialist Union and the Communist Action Parties rejected the Liberal Kurd Party's ambition for this external factor idea to help bring about change. The latter groups wanted to bring in money from outside and support from outside. The Socialist and Communist parties, along with the Kurds, the Kurd left parties, and then the second Kurdish party that was led by Nasruddin Ibrahim, started looking for this third way between the Damascus Declaration and the Ba'athist government. The Muslim Brotherhood left altogether in early 2009. In late 2009, the Kurdish groups, not the PYD, but other Kurdish groups, the Kurdish Political Council was what was created in 2009. And the government did begin to crack down on some of these. And again, look at the people who are taking place in these meetings in these forums. Right? We had the Atasi Forum finally being closed. The U.S.-funded channels Al Hurra and Radio Sawa were banned and removed. Right? Not a bad thing. Remember, what was the United States doing with these channels? The United States this was entirely an act of propaganda and entirely an act of destabilization of Syrian society. So it's good for them that they banned these stations. This was an act of aggression. This was not freedom. This is not a freedom of speech issue. This was an act of destabilization in Syria on the part of the United States. So the unified opposition, in that sense, broke down, and that attempt at a political color revolution was somewhat dampened at that point. The basis for any Islamist cooperation with people who were pluralist or secular or nationalist or even left was always very, very thin. Right? Even if it was simply based on complaints about the corruption and the government repression, they shared some rhetoric, but they could not get along. Islamists cannot get along with anybody. Leftists have a hard time getting along with anybody. Both groups have a hard time getting along with each other. So you can see the hurdle that the West was facing here. It's interesting that the Muslim Brotherhood is often going around and citing human rights as being the casualty of a repressive system, but they're very selective about those aspects that they use to help their own cause. Their own human rights record is appalling. They have committed numerous atrocities, not only before the Syrian crisis that began in 2011, but during the Syrian crisis, they've committed a lot of atrocities. So anything about human rights coming from the Muslim Brotherhood should be immediately dismissed. This is not an organization to be trusted. Now, they actually did, back in the 1950s, sit in Syrian parliament, but they haven't. Once they were banned and shut down back in the 80s, they haven't done as much. The Syrian Authoritarianism, as I mentioned earlier, not trying to justify it, but we have to understand that it has to do mostly with suppressing groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, right? It has to do with suppressing assassinations and massacres and atrocities and sectarian insurrections. This is not necessarily Syrian society, but Islamist groups funded from outside sources launching an insurrection and committing these atrocities. And that includes the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, after this Damascus Declaration and all this stuff fell apart, the United States started seeing that the so-called secular opposition, and I wouldn't call it necessarily even a secular opposition, but it was the political color revolution opposition that the U.S. was trying to promote, was essentially feckless. It was powerless. They couldn't even get along with each other, and this was at the political level. So that attempt largely fell apart, and they saw that Bashar al-Assad not only remained popular, but he was extremely popular in Syria. They had, in 2009, there was a 6-country poll, and the question was, who was the greatest threat to the region? Israel won 88%, and the United States won 77% of that poll about who was the greatest threat to the region. They also asked who was the most popular Arab leader in the Middle East. It was Bashar al-Assad. That is definitely a different presentation of Assad than what the United States has tried to present it as. Now, I don't have any more time available in the show to go through in any more detail. Perhaps we'll do this in the future. I want to talk about those reforms in more detail and show that Assad himself was a reformer. I've mentioned it, but I didn't get really into the details of these reforms, because I think that is important. Perhaps we'll do that, go into more detail in the coming weeks if time allows, and if there's not any major pressing issues that we need to discuss as a matter of strategy. We're also going to talk about, hopefully next week, the strategy of political demands for activism here in the United States on a number of different issues. That's going to be important as well as we try to reach out. We've got a number of listeners and readers who have contacted me about my previous call about activism and pushing these demands, who are taking action, and we encourage you to do that. And please send me an email and let me know what you've got going on and what's taking place, and what demand you're working toward, and how you're doing it, because we need an increase of activism here in the United States. Our window of opportunity is closing, but we can still get this done as we get this new wave of political awareness and activism shaping up. So, ladies and gentlemen, this has been Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week.
Don't you see why? You are listening to